This is the new iPhone 14 Pro, but is it everything that I hoped it would be? Maybe. What's up, Internet? I'm Brian MacDuff, aka BMAC, and welcome to the video. And if you like videos about tech reviews, product unboxings, and filmmaking and photography tutorials, make sure you smash that subscribe button with all notifications turned on so that you never miss another video on this channel. So here we are with the 16th generation iPhone, the iPhone 14 Pro. First things first, I want to give a huge thank you and a shout out to Apple for actually sending over an iPhone 14 Pro and an iPhone 14 Pro Max for me to be able to check out. So Apple, thank you. I appreciate ya. And with that having been said, let's get into reviewing this baby. First things first, let's talk about the iPhone 14 Pro design and how things are looking on the outside of this fancy new iPhone. To be honest, not much has changed a whole heck of a lot externally on the iPhone 14 Pro. We still have our flat stainless steel edges, we still have our matte glass back, and we still do have that large 3-lens camera housing protruding from the back of the phone itself. But one of the big design changes we do have here actually relates to the display, where we have a new pill-shaped camera cutout system. And the cool thing is, this pill-shaped camera cutout for the front camera and the true depth camera system is so much more than just a cutout. But besides that, you're also gonna notice physically the lack of any kind of SIM card tray, because Apple has actually finally switched over to the eSIM life. Size-wise, we are once again getting two different sizes of the iPhone 14 Pro, in either a regular 6.1-inch size or a max 6.7-inch size. With color options this year being silver, gold, deep purple, or space black colors. I have the deep purple with the iPhone 14 Pro Max over here and the space black with the iPhone 14 Pro. I do most definitely miss my beloved Sierra blue color that we had in last year's iPhone Pro lineup, but with space black as an option now, I could live with that. But that does about cover your iPhone 14 Pro design. You still get the lightning port on the bottom, so no USB-C yet. You still do get an IP68 dust and waterproof rating, and it still does look like one of the prettiest smartphones of all time. But if we could just somehow make those sides matte and make that back rear camera housing flush with the entire phone itself, then we'd really be talking perfection. Just saying. But an integral part of the iPhone experience has always been the display. So what's the display like on the iPhone 14 Pro, and what does it look like? The iPhone 14 Pro gets an OLED display with wide color gamut support, HDR support, and a 120Hz refresh rate, complete with a 2,000,000:1 contrast ratio, capable of up to 1,000 typical nits of brightness. But two major differences this year as it specifically relates to the display is, one, we finally get an always-on display, and of course, like we mentioned earlier, we do get that new dynamic island, that pill-shaped cutout, which is going to actually be a lot more than just a cutout. We'll start out with the always-on display here, and it's no secret that this is a feature I've been basically demanding since we got a variable refresh rate in the iPhone. Truth be told, I really do think this is something that could have been implemented or at least enabled in the iPhone 13 Pro, with it being able to actually reduce its refresh rate down to 10 Hertz. Did we really need to wait a whole extra year, a 9 Hertz difference to get an always-on display? You know, Apple. Marketing. But with that having been said, I will honestly say that I've been using the always-on display on the iPhone 14 Pro since I got it, and it's pretty darn awesome. Probably worth the wait, and you could even choose to, if you want to, on the always-on display, actually utilize it with or without the wallpaper. But that's one of the cool things that Apple implemented to make their always-on display perhaps a little bit cooler than the rest, where you could actually utilize it with a wallpaper on at all times. But the other exciting feature we absolutely have to talk about here, and arguably the feature or the change that is the most buzzworthy as it relates to the iPhone 14 Pro, this pill-shaped front camera cutout that we talked about earlier, which Apple is calling the dynamic island. This camera cutout is so much more than just a cutout in the sense that you could actually interact with it, and it will give you notifications and updates, sort of like a shortcut menu bar. It'll show you your current tasks that you're running in the background, such as GPS navigation, an AirDrop transfer, even a timer if you wanted to look at that, or the current music that's playing. So it's gonna actually provide you with a lot of information in what would otherwise be just a cutout. It also does act as a little shortcut bar where all I have to do is just tap on that icon of whatever it is that it's doing, bringing you directly to that app, and once again, a buttery smooth iOS animation. So in a very rather iconic way, this dynamic island cutout is perhaps less intrusive than a full-on notch, but also more helpful than you'd expect it to be. So in a way, yes, very much less is more here, at least as it relates to the dynamic island. But another area where Apple has always impressed me, and probably everyone else, has to do with the cameras. So what kind of camera upgrades are we getting this year on the iPhone 14 Pro? Let's get right to it and talk about one of the biggest upgrades you're getting with the iPhone 14 Pro camera system this year, the fact that the main wide-angle lens now has a 48 megapixel sensor. The way this process is gonna work is that the iPhone 14 Pro is gonna by default pixel bin those 48 megapixels down to 12 megapixels. The image is still gonna utilize those extra megapixels to allow more light to hit the sensor, which should leave you with overall better tones, better saturation, better dynamic range, and at the end of the day, better overall image composition. Which, by the way, that 2x zoom option that you have on the iPhone 14 Pro, that's also essentially zooming in on the 48 megapixel sensor, which gives you that 2x optical zoom equivalent. This is actually also in part how the action mode on the iPhone 14 Pro works. It's basically an ultra stabilized mode, and it works by combining optical image stabilization, sensor shift stabilization, and now some digital stabilization to give you a super stabilized ending clip that quite honestly looks like it was taken on an action camera or on a camera that was on a gimbal. But one thing that does upset me with the iPhone 14 Pro camera system this year is specifically with the wide angle lens, and we do have a downgrade in terms of minimum focus distance. The iPhone 14 Pro wide-angle lens has a 7.8-inch minimum focus distance, while the iPhone 13 Pro only had a 5.9-inch minimum focus distance. Now I know this doesn't sound like a huge deal, but honestly, if you're like me and you're taking a lot of close-up shots of objects, whether it be your new favorite craft beer or anything else that's in front of you, you're used to that 5 to 8-inch range when you're capturing photos on your iPhone. So I found myself to be capturing more and more photos on the iPhone 14 Pro that were blurry simply because I was too close to the object with that minimum focus distance being further away now. Is this a deal breaker? No. You could always just pinch to zoom or slightly move back just a little bit, but the less steps I need to take and the less things I have to worry about when I want to take a photo with my phone, just taking it out of my pocket, the better. But besides all this talk about the main wide angle lens, we still do have to talk about the ultra wide lens here, and of course the telephoto lens, both of which, as you can imagine, are still producing beautiful results. We do have a 3x telephoto camera, that's a 12 megapixel f2.8 lens, and a 12 megapixel ultra wide lens with a slightly slower aperture than last year at f2.2, but there is a new sensor for the ultra wide camera that will ultimately allow more light to hit the sensor in the iPhone 14 Pro, therefore allowing for better low light performance with the ultra wide camera. And since macro shots use the ultra wide lens, this means that your macro shots are gonna turn out a tad sharper as well. Or if video is more your thing, you're capable of shooting up to 4K 60 frames per second or 4K 30 frames per second in the HDR ProRes video codec, also with support to shoot in up to 4K 30 frames per second in cinematic mode. All in all, you should love the camera upgrades that we get in the iPhone 14 Pro. It's not a perfect system, and in my eyes, there are some tweaks that need to be made, but my goodness, this is the reason why I don't even bring my mirrorless camera with me when I'm going out places anymore. Because the results I get on the iPhone 14 Pro are absolutely stunning, and sometimes even better than what I could pull off in a multi-$1,000 mirrorless camera. But all of this power, display beauty, and camera capability is of course in large part because of the performance behind the iPhone 14 Pro and what this baby's packing on the inside. In the iPhone 14 Pro, we are getting the A16 Bionic chip with a 6-core GPU, 5-core CPU, and a 16-core neural engine, complete with 6 gigs of RAM. So on the 14 Pro, whether you're using it for your creative processes or something like mobile gaming, you've got power and performance for nearly everything you'd want to pull off with this thing. It should go without saying that the iPhone 14 Pro is a powerhouse of a smartphone, and it outperforms every other iPhone ever made, and it actually does seem to be outscoring even the latest Snapdragon 8 Gen 1 chipset. So kind of an industry leader here as it relates to performance, but at the same time, not too surprising. You do also get crash detection built into the iPhone 14 Pro, but honestly, from what I've heard and from my own personal experiences, it might be causing more problems than it's intended to. I've also heard of this happening for individuals who have their iPhone 14 Pros in their pocket when they're on a roller coaster. So hopefully Apple's going to improve the crash detection. Obviously a feature you hope you never actually have to use, but if it's going to be there and it's going to be working, we better hope that it's going to work right. We don't want false alarms. But let's talk about storage options. You still get 128 gigs, 256 gigs, 512 gigs, or a 1 terabyte option for your storage. And even though I'm doing a lot more storage in the cloud these days, I still do recommend you get the highest possible capacity you can as it relates to storage with the iPhone 14 Pro. The more local storage you have to work with, the better. Get the highest amount you could afford. But with all this going on, how long can you expect the iPhone 14 Pro to last for? What's the battery life in this beast of a smartphone? The iPhone 14 Pro Max has about a 4,300 milliampere hour battery with 11 hours plus of screen on time, while the iPhone 14 Pro has a 3,200 milliampere hour battery with about 9 hours plus of screen on time. So about 2 hours more battery life out of the larger sized iPhone 14 Pro Max. But with all of this having been said, here are my final thoughts on the iPhone 14 Pro and whether or not I think it's the right iPhone for you. I can go on the record and say that the iPhone 14 Pro is the best iPhone I have ever owned from pretty much every perspective. The overall camera system is mind-blowingly good, the performance is insanely fast and fluid, and we now get an always-on display that's, well, always on. I am, for the first time in a very long time, pretty darn content with the iPhone 14 Pro, and I'm actually starting to have somewhat of an issue deciding what I would want to be built upon and improved on in the future generations of the iPhone. I mean, of course, I'm gonna find some improvements that need to be made. I've already mentioned some of them throughout the course of this review, but at the end of the day, I can mostly only say great things about the iPhone 14 Pro, and I love it, and I think you will too. Beast, an absolute beast of a smartphone. That's all that needs to be said, really. As always, if you're interested in learning more about the iPhone 14 Pro or to snag one of these beasts of a smartphone for yourself, you guys can of course always head to my affiliate link, bmac.link/iPhone 14 Pro, or of course there will always be a clickable link in the video description box below as well, so check that out. And I'm gonna go take some more macro photos, maybe run around with my dog in the backyard, get some more action mode shots. Goodness, so many possibilities. I will see you guys in my next video. Oscar, get your leash, we're going outside.